Hi, my name is Savannah Wheeler, and this is my oral defense for my action research paper for the course EDLE 6753. My paper is titled Reading Literacy Gaps in Academic Vocabulary: The Strengths and Struggles of Low Socioeconomic Students. So the concept of enhancing reading comprehension and literacy is probably the most foundational concept in which educators attempt to place importance. But unfortunately, disparity among socioeconomic groups creates a major challenge for schools and teachers and districts, and consequently, we're seeing this as an issue amongst the United States as a whole. So, as an educator myself, I have been immersed in this firsthand, and I've seen the disparity. Therefore, I wanted to investigate this topic further, and so I started with research. And as you see here, I have 10 different studies that discuss how poverty affects reading literacy in students. Okay, we've got Haskins, Mermain, Sawhill, and Snow from 2012, Maxwell from 2012, Pearson, Peterson, Rodriguez, and Taylor from 2003, Byrne, Cummings, DeGener, and Kuroa from 2013, Ethne Kennedy from 2010, Deborah Owens 2006-2007, Cunningham from 2006, Diane Barone from 2010, Walker Dalhouse and Risco from 2008, and Susan Newman and Donna Solano from 2013. Each of these studies contributed to my literature review. In Haskins, Mermain, Sawhill, and Snow, they conducted a study that assessed reading literacy rates in the United States in regard to international standards. So they put the United States literacy rates up against literacy rates from the entire world. The study's major emphasis was on the way that the No Child Left Behind Act affected these standards and the requirements for students across the U.S. in terms of their academic readiness. Unfortunately, the study failed to include other factors that would have an effect on student reading literacy rates because it did give such an in-depth analysis of the No Child Left Behind Act and how it compares to other countries. Maxwell 2012 tested the connection between poverty and education pretty in-depth. This research connected really well with Haskins, Mermain, Sawhill, and Snow in regard to that discussion of the No Child Left Behind Act and how it greatly affected student literacy rates and the readiness standards. Pearson, Peterson, Rodriguez, and Taylor assessed what effects teaching had on student readiness assessment scores and how different teaching strategies affected the way students learn. Byrne, Cummings, DeGener, and Kuroa from 2013 found that really a passion and instilling a love for reading in students is what propelled them to become better readers. It focused mainly on those Common Core standards and that methodology, and so unfortunately it wasn't applicable to every facet of education because not every state, such as Texas, we don't follow Common Core. Ethne Kennedy from 2010 explained that the issue of low reading literacy among low socioeconomic groups of students is not just a problem in the United States. That disparity is actually an issue worldwide, and it focused primarily on the effects of high stakes testing in terms of those low socioeconomic status students, and literacy rates and the challenges that those students are faced with in regard to high-stakes testing. Deborah Owens discussed the implementation of a reading curriculum, and she did a specific study in one specific classroom, and unfortunately the curriculum that was implemented was unsuccessful, and that study kind of delved into why it was such a failure and what they should have focused on in terms of teaching students how to read. Cunningham 2006 talked about the correlation of poverty and test scores. She claimed, which this was one of the most influential articles and bits of research that I read, she claimed that there is high poverty, and where there is high poverty, you can expect low test scores. And so I thought that was extremely intriguing. Diane Barone from 2010 discussed the importance of going beyond the scope of in-class literacy and taking it to families and parents. She focused specifically on ELLs, English language learners. Walker Dalhouse Briscoe from '08 analyzed poverty on a grander scale, and she looked at various facets as well as homelessness and how that affects children's literacy rates even more than just standard poverty. And then Susan Newman and Donna Solano wrote a book, and they analyzed the way poverty affects reading literacy rates, but it was a very wide scale. They talked about the way that literacy is not just reading literacy as in a student reading a book. They talked about the disparity in technological literacy and how students who don't have opportunity to utilize technology regularly have a disadvantage as well. So overall, reading ability and comprehension are essentially foundational to a student's ability to acquire knowledge. That's how we learn. The disadvantage to students who live in poverty and what they face in terms of reading literacy really creates an achievement gap that teachers and districts, principals, superintendents long to close in order to increase student success and to prepare students for the future. 21st century learners and preparing them is a challenging task, but when you add additional roadblocks to students, such as poverty, the chances of a student reaching a level of readiness for their future and a readiness level necessary to achieve great success is a challenge. Thus, my research inspired these two questions and what I based my own research off of. First, does poverty affect secondary students' understanding of academic vocabulary in a public school? So I narrowed it in and zeroed in on this question. And then, is reading literacy in a public school and public school teenagers later affected by that low socioeconomic status background? The purpose of my study was to understand how that poverty affects secondary students' reading literacy and the understanding of that academic vocabulary that we see in the SAT, the ACT preparation. And I conducted this study with 51 ninth grade students at a local high school. This study evaluated the reasoning behind these large gaps and the gaps that these students still have despite many years of intervention and instruction, RTI. Students' literacy levels may have grown slightly, however, that was not the main purpose, the leading investigative standpoint for this study. The methods that I used, so I have an established vocabulary, procedure, and structure in my classroom, in the ninth grade English classroom where the study was conducted. Students were given 10 to 12 ACT, SAT preparatory vocabulary words to learn weekly. And we broke down those words. We learned their root, the part of speech, the language of origin to help with spelling purposes. We really dissected these words. Students were encouraged to identify these words in various places, such as social media. If they heard another teacher say the word, if they could show me or prove it to me, they were given bathroom passes or a homework pass. So they're really encouraged to be involved with the vocabulary, to really work with it and understand it. This data included vocabulary scores, so weekly vocabulary scores and how they grew. And then the vocab scores, the vocab tests, were partnered with State of Texas Assessment of Academic Readiness, so STAR-based reading assessments. The data that was collected shows that the question of low socioeconomic status does play a role in students' overall understanding of academic vocabulary. And I'm going to show you a few different examples of this data analysis and various figures following this slide. There were slight increases in Group 2, and I'm going to talk to you about the groups in just a moment, compared to Group 1, which was the expectation for this study. So I broke the students into two groups. One was a group of low socioeconomic status. The other group was a group of students that did not qualify under the low socioeconomic status. The counselor sent home a survey prior to this, prior to my data collection, that assessed whether students received free and reduced lunch, which was the basis for my groupings, the low socioeconomic status versus the non-socioeconomic status. All right. My expectation was that the students who did not qualify for the low socioeconomic status would have higher vocab and testing scores. These results built to the assumption that the factors mentioned actually do affect reading literacy in public school teenagers based on a low socioeconomic status background. In Figure 1, you see the descriptive statistics that were ran based on the data of the vocabulary scores versus Group 1 and 2. If you look to the left, Group 1 descriptive statistics was for the group that qualified for the low socioeconomic status. My mean score, my average score was at 69 over the course of 6 different tests. The median, the middle score was a 75.73. There was no mode, there was no score that reoccurred, and there was a standard deviation of 11.89, so almost 12. This test was run at a confidence level of 95%, meaning if I reproduce this test 95% of the time, it would have the same accuracy. And then if you look over to your right-hand side, Group 2 was the group that did not qualify based on low socioeconomic status. Their mean was 74.96, almost 75. The median score, the middle score, was 80.9. There was no mode again, as seen in Group 1. Confidence level again was rated at 95%. There was a standard deviation of 19. Next just shows you a really clear graph of the vocabulary testing scores and gives you a good visual of the low socioeconomic status students versus the non-low socioeconomic students based on the 6 vocabulary tests that I issued in class. And this is the data analysis where all of the students were had their scores inputted. You have test 1, test 2, a reading test was given, a reading comprehension test was given. Test 3, test 4, another reading comprehension test. 5 and 6, another reading comprehension test. And over in the bottom right-hand corner, you have student group 2, which was the students that did not qualify for the low SES and their scores. Student group 1, like I said, is to the left. Student group 2 is at the bottom right. So my findings for this research conclude that, in fact, it appears that the low socioeconomic factors did play a role in low reading literacy rates among secondary students. This information backs several claims from the research method previously mentioned in the literature review. So all of the literature in the studies done kind of back this claim. The understanding of academic vocabulary seems to have improved the test scores, with the exception of the third test. An anomaly to the data includes vocabulary test number 6, where both student groups scores actually only scored 1.15 points different from each other. Overall, the data revealed what was expected throughout the research process, and that is that the students who qualified under that low socioeconomic status did score lower on the academic vocabulary and reading comprehension tests compared to the students who did not qualify. However, overall, there was growth in both groups. Limitations to this study include the sample size. The study was only able to be conducted amongst 51 students. Also, the shorter time span in which the research was conducted was a limitation. And then the single placement would have been better if the study could have been conducted amongst a larger group. To get a more accurate depiction of the role that poverty plays in regard to reading literacy, a larger sample size would have been beneficial. Overall, though, I would expect that if the study was conducted, it would reach the same conclusion.